Great. Good morning, everyone. This is House Rules on Wednesday, March 1st. We have two agenda items today. The first, remote voting in committee, continuing that conversation with a possible vote, and then HR 6, which is a House resolution updating House rules. So we are going to start with remote voting in committee. So we've had a couple conversations about different ways to increase and support members in this new era of the pandemic and how we can better create access and work-life balance and try to address some of the concerns that have come up, while also being really clear and strict about the integrity of our votes and when it is appropriate to have remote participation and voting. So just as a reminder, currently what we have is that members are allowed to participate remotely. They do not count as part of the quorum if they're participating remotely. And so the next part of our conversation is when is it or how do we want to approach the conversation of when it would be appropriate to vote. And so based on some of the conversations we've been having, I thought it would be helpful to have a draft to work from, and then we can take it from there. So I'll hand this out, and then if our incredible clerk could do a walkthrough of it on the screen. So paper and screen, does that work for folks? Okay. Thank you. Right. Can we see this? Excellent. Yeah. Great. Okay.
Okay, Madam Speaker, members, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. This is a first draft that would authorize limited remote committee voting through the first Friday of the 2024 adjourned session. It is written as what I'll call session rule, like you have session law. It would not be codified in your rules. It is just an HR. If adopted, it would apply through this temporary period, which right now is the first Friday of next year. Essentially, you could get through that first week to determine whether to make any other changes. The first resolve clause would say that through that first Friday, which is Friday, January 5th, 2024, each member of a House committee is authorized to vote remotely in that committee, and there are two current conditions. Number one, if the member has tested positive for COVID-19 and is within a required period of isolation, and number two, for not more than 3 days for any other reason. The language would go on to say, as a second resolve clause, that such a member shall notify the committee chair and clerk that the member is exercising this remote voting authority and shall count toward a committee quorum. And the third resolve clause is that the committee clerk would record any vote cast by the member as a remote vote and shall track the number of days the member exercises the member's non-COVID-19 remote voting authority, since this draft would provide that there is a limit of 3.
So why don't we start at the top? So we had been talking in previous meetings about having it be a pilot to test it out. We are almost halfway through the session, and we know that there are committees that meet over the summer and the fall. So this is a place for conversation, but this would give us time to look at the data. There's nothing that says we couldn't meet before that first Friday to set us up for session if we wanted to make adjustments, or we could wait till the first week. But this is a starting point. Thoughts on the pilot timeline? Yep. Okay. All right. Okay.
I've already talked to you.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So we have these two. Let's start with the one. So continuing with COVID, required period of isolation, both.
I guess I do have a question.
Yeah.
What if the CDC changes their policy? Because we've been following CDC guidelines.
Right.
So what if in April, they say there is no period of isolation, then what happens?
Mhm.
Just a question. I have no idea.
We could tie it in. We could use the same language that we've done in the past.
I was gonna suggest something, either that or just leaving it in here in case COVID comes raging back and the CD, and the CD guidelines revert back. So whatever, I guess.
Well, that's why I think if we say follow CDC guidelines, if
Yep.
they're gonna lift them.
Lift it,
and we lift this,
reinstitute.
If they're gonna
Mhm.
bring them back or even strengthen them instead of, I think currently it's 5 days, might be more, might be less.
Thoughts on just adding that tie-in language with the CDC?
And I just looked back at so you've done how many versions of this resolution?
Yeah.
So I just looked back to your 2022 HR 20, which allowed remote voting in House sessions and House committees due to COVID. And actually, I'm just reminding myself that at that resolution, you used as provided by Vermont Department of Health guidelines. I think maybe there were.
But we linked to CDC.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a preference. You had used VDH guidelines before. I'm not sure which one you feel is more
I mean, I
appropriate.
think we should maybe follow what we've done in the past.
Vermont Department of Health guidelines, as provided by Vermont Department of Health guidelines.
I do think they were based on CDC recommendations.
Yeah.
I
Right.
think they've been linked, right?
I think they've been linked, so I think to keep it
Consistent.
consistent
folks-
with what we.
Yeah.
done in the past.
Health Department, I'm just looking around the table for, it's nodding, yep. Okay, all right.
So just added that highlighted language.
So we're discussing number
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
Should be A or the, within A or within the. I don't know if it makes a difference.
I didn't hear your comment, I'm sorry.
Should it be within the required or within a required?
Oh, okay.
I don't know which makes more sense.
I mean, I don't know if I'm comfortable at this point, even with number one. We are much further into the session. We're not like uncertain about what status we're in. We're not really in a pandemic. We're in, what's it called, endemic. We have all sorts of other contagious illnesses that people need to stay away from the State House for, which we hopefully always have if they have something contagious or a lot of different things. And I'm not sure why we would carve out COVID anymore at this point. And that, we probably should be back to recognizing the full gravitas, if you will, of what it means to vote for a bill in your committee in the State House, and respect that and maintain that.
Rep. James and then Bartholomew.
I guess my thought on that would be that while we are moving to a period in our nation's, history where COVID is considered to be endemic, we're not there yet, because the CDC does still have guidelines that we're operating under, and folks still are quarantining or asked to isolate when they contract it. And so in my mind, the linking it to the CDC guidelines resolves your concern, because if the CDC lifts the guidelines, then anybody who is ill or has COVID simply would move into subsection number 2, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Number 2.
Well, that's, it's tying the two now, which might complicate the conversation, but I mean, I see two as
Well, I could-
far
I could
more
make that as a
problematic.
standalone. Okay.
So let's,
Yeah, just on one here,
I'm
yeah.
not getting ahead of
Don't-
myself.
Right,
My
thank,
comment
good.
stands.
Yeah,
on
no,
number one.
I think that's it's a good comment.
Representative Bartholomew.
I was going to make the same point, is that it's still treated differently by CDC, and there isn't a required or suggested quarantine period for cold or for the flu, as far as I know. So they're treating it differently. we probably should continue, and that's what this does.
All right, any other thoughts on number 1? No? All right, well then let's move to number 2. I will just say one of the things that we have been wrestling with is just the dynamic between a member talking with a chair about a reason why they might be absent. And I think I'm a little nervous about a chair being put in an awkward position of whether or not to say something is okay or not okay. And so this is the needle that we've been trying to thread, is how we can create accountability for an absence while also not creating an awkward situation between a member and a chair and that dynamic. So this is where this idea was born out of having it just be, like in the workplace, there's 3 days. This was a place we just thought where we are in the session, that would be a good number to start with and to test out and see what happens when we enact something like this. So anyway, that's just the context for this number 2.
So I just want to say, yesterday evening was the first I heard about this concept, which, just struck me as a really kind of bizarre way to address things, that all of a sudden it's sort of a massive expansion for any reason, when in fact we've never, it would be a big new discussion to say that there are times unrelated to COVID that you could vote remotely. We've had lots of times in the past where people had to be away for extended periods of time sometimes. This feels like a huge new, sort of like get out of jail free card that you can randomly pull out of the deck. It just is, maybe it's because it's such a new concept, is part of why I feel it's so completely, it's a bizarre shift away from what does it mean to serve in the legislature, and why is it that you need to be here, and what are the needs of the body versus personal needs that you would normally address on your own. And people have to be away for any number of reasons. They have a compelling work issue. They need to be away, and they're away, and any number of things. And you recognize that on that day you're not going to be able to vote. We've got the big advantage now that people can go back and look at a recording. But this just strikes me as going far beyond what we've ever done, and for no clear reason that I can see. It's just a strange expansion.
All right, I saw some hands, Representative James, and then Representative Mulvaney Stanek.
Yeah, to me, especially in the context of 3 days and a limited pilot, which I think is important, to see how it goes. Rather than this being a sort of, as you called it, Rep. Donahue, a bizarre expansion, I see it as a very important step that we can take to acknowledge folks' real lives and how things truly are right now. Instead of looking, while I understand that tradition and how we have always done things is really important, I do also think we need to be open to looking at ways that the legislature might responsibly and slowly evolve to be a place where more people can serve. And right now, to say that you can't vote in committee, and I know that I know, and I'm glad that that's not on the table right now at all, to limit this only to committee, says that if you are sick, not with COVID, if you are caring for an ill family member, if you have a crisis in your life, that you can still be accountable to your work in the legislature and accountable to your voters by showing up to your job in this limited way instead of just having to miss it.
Representative Mulvaney Stan?
Thank you. So I think there's actually a clear reason for this to move in this direction, and to build off of Representative James' points. This is one very real barrier for people serving in the legislature, whether they have small children or an ill family member, aging, whatever is in their family. And this seems like a very reasonable start. This exists in other regular workplaces, and this is a workplace at the end of the day. And so to me, there's a lot of precedent all around us with every other employer acknowledging that people need personal days sometimes. And if anything, this is actually encouraging people to still show up and do their job while taking care of whatever they're doing in their reality. So to me, this is aligning the legislature with workplace standards that exist in many other places. And more importantly, until and if this job ever becomes, and that's a whole other ball of wax, a job, a full paying job, I think we asked too much of folks in terms of sacrificing to be here. And the last thing I'll just say is, I think, tradition often excludes people from being able to serve. And we've seen that with the number of people who've been able to serve with small children in this district, in this job. And I don't think honoring tradition is always 100% the right thing to do. Sometimes we have to be responsive to what modern day needs are and what, the full breadth of Vermont and who's not represented in this building, because we want to truly represent democracy that benefits everyone. So I think there is a very clear reason for us to move in this direction. And it seems very reasonable. And when I shared this with my caucus, there was a question about why not 4 days, because the length of a legislative week is 4 days. And so if someone has needed to use all that block and they thought, well, there's a lot of activity going on and crossover at the end of the session, 4 days seems to be more aligned with the schedule realities of the legislature. So.
Thank you. And I appreciate everyone's thought on this. Where I get caught up is this is supposed to be for protecting us from, the spread of COVID-19. And I hear things like the start of something and progress to maybe even more remote down the road. I don't want this to be an open door for other policies that come from that. I have 2 children. They take up a lot of my life. I coach almost all their teams, and it is a tough juggle to be here. I signed up for it when I decided to run for office. I was like, I'm going to lean on my family more. I'm going to lean on my support systems a lot more, and they know that. I have to deal with it still. Getting home late at night is not the best thing in the world, just in time for bedtime, but we know it's only through May, so we're almost there. But I do appreciate everyone's sentiment on it. It is tough. It's not the easiest, and I can tell you that I've made a lot of sacrifices, but it was part of the job that I signed up for, and I am worried about this becoming just like an open door for the next kind of policy changes.
So I don't want to repeat what others have said, but I do support this 3-day proposal. I'm not hung up on number of days. It's a pilot, so 3 seemed reasonable if we're halfway through the session. And I also recognize the need to follow tradition in whatever way we can, and that we all know what we're getting into when we get into this job. But I also know that there are people who can't get into this job because of the challenges that they have. And it's a sacrifice, as you said, Representative Tu, for all of us to do this job in many ways. And I also want to make it clear for anyone who's thinking about this, this is literally being able to vote in committee, which in some committees happens quite rarely, right? And so it places the onus of responsibility on the member to assess, whatever their reason is, whether they need to come in and participate remotely and vote that day or not. And so if I were in this situation, I would be thinking, is this an important day for me to do it? I only have 1 day left, and should I do it today or not? Should I, and it's just placing the responsibility on the individual member to make the decision on which day to use and to vote remotely. They are already able to participate fully in committee remotely. And so I'm very interested to see, because this is a response to members of my caucus coming to me and saying, I want this ability to be able to do this. what I'm curious about is how often it will get used. And this is a pilot program, and I want to support members who want to be here and want to be able to vote when they are able to participate anyway. So that's my sense.
Any other, yeah, Representative Donahue?
Sure, just if everyone's had their first round. I want to just briefly reflect on the idea that, you know, it's every other workplace you can do this. Well, we can now take personal days if we need to for any reason. And if you're in another work position and you can be away if you need to, you can be away, but that doesn't mean you're able to actually do your work. You need to be away that day. And I think that's true here. I also don't think this is any other workplace. I think this does carry very unique aspects. And I would never defend continuing something based on tradition. To me, this doesn't have anything to do with tradition. It has to do with whether or not we believe that it's crucial to the process of good lawmaking to actually be present face to face in a room with your colleagues when you're taking a vote on legislation. And I think that is crucial to the process. I think that is a really important piece of accountability. And so I really think that this kind of an expansion, even on a pilot basis, I don't think we should be piloting something if one doesn't feel it's something we should be doing it at all, then there isn't a point to piloting. And I don't support doing it at all.
Any other thoughts? Feedback?
You know where I pulled the caucus on this. They are adamantly opposed to number 2. Maybe I can bring back number 1 if we're gonna, because we have done that in the past, and Vermont Department of Health still has the isolation. You know, I could possibly bring that back to the caucus, but they are adamantly opposed about that. And number 2, as am I, for the reasons that Representative Donahue just stated. This job isn't like any other job. We are elected to this position, and it's not just me sitting in the seat. There's 4,287 people sitting with me. So that's a huge responsibility. And for, you know, just like, you know, there are sacrifices in this job. And I sacrificed in my previous job that I did at the same time, and Representative Paella is doing the same thing. You know, elected to town clerk, treasurer for 26 years, never could call in anything, had to be present. You have to be present. You're an elected official serving your constituency. I just think that brings this to, if you want to call it a job, I've never called it a job. I mean, I think we are public servants to our constituency, and it rises to a whole other level than any other, you know, paid position. So that's where I fall on that, number 2.
Representative Long and then Jane.
So I just want to make it really clear. There has not been one member who's come to me asking for this that hasn't agreed that being in person is a better way to operate. I don't think this is not, you know, this is not a let's have a way to get out of being here. This is, I would rather be there in person. There are times when I absolutely cannot. And so I just want to, I just, people feel very strongly as elected officials that they are required to do the job that they have here. This just allows a little flexibility. There's no disagreement that being in person is preferable. These are the times that I can't be. A few times.
But to me, I always think about sort of hypothetical examples that seem like they could actually, you know, that seem realistic. And so when I think about this, I think about a bill that my committee has been taking testimony on for weeks. You know, I've been following along closely. It's a bill that matters a great deal to my community and to my constituents. And as I'm driving up to the State House that day, I have a car accident. And I'm fine, but my car has to get towed and I have no way to get to the State House. how am I more or less accountable to my voters and to my job in the legislature and to my community by having to miss that vote, or by being able to take one of my 3 days and log in so that I can be there for that vote that I've been following for a couple months. I think it's the latter. I think that's more accountable.
Hard cases make bad law.
It's
But in
very
addition,
unrealistic.
something like that, that the vote can wait a day. There can be a delay on taking the vote if your car has to be towed. We can all come up with individual examples, but this is really about a pretty fundamental philosophy, I think, in how we legislate. And we obviously have a difference of opinion of how important. I recognize that no one thinks it's as good, but the degree to how important it is that if you're voting, that you be there with your colleagues face to face and in public. So.
And then just briefly, one other comment. I mean, starting in at 3 and even here today, not 15 minutes into the conversation, well, why not 4? And then why not 5? Or why not 7? Or that's my concern. We've already heard it sitting around this table. Well, 3 is not enough. So that is my concern about opening that door, and then it just keeps getting wider and wider and wider. And as Representative Dunn said, you hold the vote. You hold the vote and you don't vote until the next day. Nothing, I just, and, the caucus is adamant about that one. And as I said, number 1, with that provision in there, VDH guidelines, possibly, this one would be a go, but number 2 is, nobody is in favor of that.
I would just say that, we've been having this conversation for a long time about how we can make this place more accessible for people to run and to serve. And we've talked about many different ways, even potentially moving our break to match with school break. I think that this is an ongoing conversation, and we're always we've done this so much during COVID, right? Of adjusting our rules and to meet the situation and where we are. And I think that with this being very limited to 3 days and a pilot with a check back just to committees and not the floor is a very limited, clear step forward to address these concerns, while also balancing, accountability. And so I'm not, unless someone's making a motion or something, I want to stick with 3. I think that's a good starting place. Representative Mulvaney.
Thank you. I often I reflect in this job about it's a job that there is no boss, and yet we have rules that we try to make sure that people are knowing what they're signing up for in this role, in this job. And ultimately, the people who keep us accountable and who are our boss are our constituents. And so I think we have to remember that at the end of the day, that our constituents want us to show up and do our best work. Our constituents elect us for who we are. Our constituents elect some of us based on what they see that they share in common with us. So for example, those of us who have young children, those of us who have aging parents, I've experienced both this session. And I understand that people don't want to hear personal stories, but it is a reality. My mother had a heart attack 3 weeks ago and I had to leave immediately. And it's still something that I'm trying to navigate while doing this job. And this resistance to having the ability to create flexibility creates a barrier for people to be able to serve. And people who have a high work ethic, I want to emphasize that. I show up for my constituents, I show up for my committee. And it feels like punishment when there's resistance for making this a more accessible job. And it is short-sighted, and it is not going to help us have the best people at the table here and doing the work that we need for Vermonters. And again, if my voters feel like me accessing 3 days to take care of family and be able to still work and to show up for them is not appropriate, then they won't vote for me. And that is the ultimate accountability. And I just hope that we can keep that in mind.
All right, other thoughts, comments, feedback on number 2? The 3 days. Okay. All right, let's move down for further discussion on the first resolve. So if this committee passes this, this is how it would be implemented. Are there thoughts on that? Yeah.
Just, I'm assuming the clerk is the clerk of the committee.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, committee chair and clerk. Yep.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay. All right, then let's go to the next one. All right, any thoughts or feedback on this second one?
This would be recorded, excuse me, recorded in the regular book that we have in each committee.
Yep.
Separate one.
And then that is something at the end, we can easily go collect the data, come back and bring back to the committee to look at. Okay. Any other thoughts on this last one? All right, and let's open up general, any further discussion? Anyone want to make a motion? All
Move to adopt.
right, and this is going to be draft 1.2, just so we're all on the same page. All right, we have a motion to accept draft 1.2. Further discussion. All right, let's give folks one more moment. Okay, any further discussion? If not, I'll call the roll. All right. Representative Bartholomew,
Yes.
Representative Donahue,
No.
Representative James,
Yes.
Representative Long,
Yes.
Representative McCoy,
No.
Representative Tooth,
No.
and I am a yes. That is 4-3, it carries. Okay, so next we have HR 4. Is that
Six.
Oh, oh, sorry. Thank you, Representative Bartholomew. Are you, by asking that question, volunteering yourself too?
When am I gonna learn? Not as he's
Yeah, you
first.
asked that too.
Okay, yes. When is it on the floor?
All right.
You noticed?
We could get it ready for introduction this afternoon. It's on the floor at 1. So, and then it's up to how you want to handle it. If you'd want to read by title and place on the next days.
I would like that,
Calendar.
so it sits there so people can see it.
So action tomorrow.
Action.
All right, thank you. All right, so HR 6, which is, I don't know if categorizing it as a cleanup bill, but maybe addressing, updating house rules. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Do you mind doing this walkthrough? Yeah.
We can start with just a brief introduction.
That would be great, thank you.
Betsy Ann and I have spent some quality time together over the past year talking about rules, going through a lot of them. I often go in and say, what does this mean and why is this here?
Mhm.
And we've gone through our 91 rules, I think, and come up with something like 7 or 8 that just need to be corrected or updated based on they're not clear and they don't make sense. And hopefully these are not anything controversial, that it's not the intent to change anything we do in a substantive way with this.
Got it. Bless you. Yes, that would be great.
So this resolution is entitled House Resolution Updating House Rules, and it would amend the rules of the House and use your standard drafting format of showing with 3 asterisks where there would be rules that are not amended. But it starts with rule number 1, which right now your very first rule says that representatives, and this is talking about representatives who are elected, present their credentials to the Secretary of State before 10 o'clock on your first day of convening on day 1 of a new biennium. This might have been what happened in the past, and actually I believe that the Senate still requires their senators by rule to bring in their credentials, which is your certificates of election, actually into the Senate office. But this, I don't know when this has stopped in the House. It's certainly not the practice. You are not required to present your certificates of election to the Secretary of State because the Secretary of State already has that. Your representative district clerks provide the certificates of election. And the canvassing committee provides your certificates of election to the Secretary of State's office. So the Secretary of State already knows who has won legislative office, and the clerk's office prepares the roll call of members on day one to go through. So this rule number 1 would be updated by this language to just say that, to reflect what actually happens in practice, that your credentials, which is in practice referring to your certificates of election, are presented to the Secretary of State in accordance with law before day 1 of the new biennium. And you'll see the rule goes on to talk about what happens on day 1 in convening and organizing. Madam Speaker, you want me to just keep going through each one, or do you want to just stop me?
Why don't we stop at each one as we go along and see how far we can get? So any questions or feedback on the changes for number 1, Representative Bartholomew?
I'll just add here that this is a rule that's bothered me since my first day. We want our members to read the rules, and when you read the first one, it's what does that mean? It's like, it's not, it needs to be accurate. So I'm glad to see that we're able to update this one.
Any other thoughts or feedback? I'm getting head nods. We're good. All right, let's go to the next one.
So then we skip ahead to Rule 43, and this talks about the number of bills that are required to be printed. You can see that right now, the clerk is required to obtain from the purchasing director, who doesn't exist, 2 originals of a bill and not less than 600 copies. Members, that has not been happening. We work with our copy room. Tony Morse is so wonderful, prints our 1 original bill that we use to do all the stamping. And then we provide a number of bills for members who request them in your bill packets, who still want to get paper copies of bills. We have that number, and then we get that number, those copies from BGS, gives them those to us every morning, and then a number of bills that go into the bill boxes that are outside of the copy room. So this language would say that the clerk would cause to be printed 1 original and then a sufficient number of copies of each bill. Why that language, sufficient number? Well, that is looking at the Senate rules, the similar language that they have in their Senate Rule 2, which requires the Senate Secretary to cause a sufficient number of bills to be printed. Why am I looking at the Senate rules? Sometimes I find it helpful for the 2 chambers to be speaking the same language, or to understand why the language is different in the 2 chambers. It helps me very much to go to the Senate and say, this is what your language says. How do you interpret this? How do you administer this language? And so right now, this draft would use that same language the Senate uses, which is a sufficient number. And that means in practice, what members want your paper copies of bills, and then what is necessary for the public in the bill bins.
Any questions on this one? Yep, Representative Donahue.
Yeah, I'm very much struggling with the term sufficient number, because it can be an understanding at any given time, and then that understanding can change when people change. I'm, always very concerned about the importance of public access and transparency. Actually, I haven't had the time or chance to focus and do anything about it, but I am really, really disturbed by our agendas not being required to be posted outside our committee rooms. And to assume that members of the public all have iPhones, and even if they have them, know how to scan whatever code it's called, because I don't know how to do it, in order to know what's happening in a public committee room. And I think it's really important that we define what sufficient number means, which is to meet the needs of every member who wants a hard copy, because some of us still live, die, and breathe by them, and for public access needs. The Senate does need fewer as a whole, because they have fewer members, and we certainly don't need 600. I'm fully in support of changing that, but I think it should have a little bit more guidance about what sufficient is intended to cover.
Representative Bartholomew.
It seems to me that this actually is a very good way to put it, because if you run out, then you don't have a sufficient number and you print more.
But,
I mean,
but,
if
but we
they're-
don't, if we don't plan ahead and know what that means, we don't print more in time for members of the public to go get one in the box if it's on the floor that day.
Let's find out how this works in practice.
Yes.
Just on that last point, Tony in the copy room is able to make extra copies for the bill bins, so that's on the record, yes.
Posting a sign if there's, like, if you're looking for bill 180 and if the box is empty, go see Tony in the copy room. If it's the public, can they do that?
I believe so. I believe that's the case in practice. I don't
I
want to
mean,
speak
if
for.
it happens to be on the floor that day and they go down to the box and there's no bill 180 that's on the floor.
I didn't think members
Which
of
it
the
may be
public were
different
allowed
anyway.
to request anything from the
Oh, they
copy
are?
room.
Okay. Well, the other issue is 180 might have changed in committee, so they wouldn't see the
It wouldn't be in the bill
bill that
box.
would be on the floor anyway.
Right, so it would be the calendar.
On the calendar, yeah, the calendar. And I don't have an issue with some sufficient number. I don't know if Tony prints more calendars than he does bills in any given day, or I have no idea.
I don't know the answer to that because our calendars definitely come, the calendars and journals and those bill packets do come directly from BGS. I just know from experience that Tony can print extra copies of bills, but I don't know what the practice, all the details of the practice for requests beyond bills, for example.
Did you have
You know,
another?
I mean, I can live with it this way as long as Madam Speaker can live with the potential of me getting up one day and saying, Madam Speaker, can we please postpone action on this bill because we've run out of copies and I don't have one that I can hold in my hand.
I'm just curious, has anyone experienced that? Like, has anyone themselves or had a caucus member say,
No, I've actually looked in the box sometimes and there's no bills in there, like they're gone. It's empty. So, I mean, it does happen, especially on a bill that's very important to a lot of people.
Yeah.
They may not request, like I request the hard copy every day, so I have
Yeah.
a calendar and I
Right.
have the bills. And so if there's one particular bill that a lot of people are interested in that don't request the hard copy, they may run down and get them, and then that one particular bill is, that box number 1 is empty. So I have seen that, but it's, you know, it's not all bills that are
right?
always empty.
Okay.
It's limited.
I think it would be helpful to have a sign for the public saying, if you need something and the box is empty, you may request and make it clear with the printer's office that a member of the public can always request a copy of the day's agenda
Yeah.
or a bill if it's not available.
Okay. Well, so what I'm hearing, please push back or have different ideas. Let's go with this language. However, let's also, and we can do this follow up, just like what happens in that situation and see if a sign is something that we can put up. And if something else comes up that we learn through this process, we can take action to address it. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts on this before moving to 44A? No? All right.
All right, so 44A is about the introduction of bills, and then it goes on to specifically discuss short form bills. And the subsection C starts out by saying, first, there's just a grammatical change, which is that when a short form bill that was changed to standard form is reported by a committee, it must appear on that notice calendar for 2 legislative days before being placed in the orders of the day. So that is your current rule. It goes on to say, also, when a committee is relieved of a short form bill for consideration by the House, and that means when a committee is relieved, it means it goes from the committee onto the notice calendar. Not that it's going from one committee to the next, but relieved from the committee to the notice calendar. Legislative council shall within 5 legislative days draft it in standard form and present it to the clerk to place it on the calendar for notice for 2 legislative days before going to action calendar. So looking at this language, that stuck out to me as a former legislative counselor because legislative counselors draft on behalf of legislators and reflect the legislative intent. What this language is saying is that a legislative counselor would be required to take a short form bill, whatever a short form bill says in its statement of purpose is the universe of that short form bill, and then require the legislative counselor to come up with the long form language. And when you consider some of the short form bills that you have and the statement of purpose that you're working with, that could be quite tricky for the legislative counselor to come up with the policy and long form. What does this one statement of purpose mean? So this potential amendment would strike that language, requiring leg council to draft short form into standard form without legislative guidance.
Represented by Thumb.
Well, I would also add, I've never seen anything like this happen. I don't know why we would ever do this, but if we did, I think it would be entirely inappropriate for someone from legislative council to be drafting a bill with no legislative guidance. That's what this, and you can conferred with head of legislative council that this is the interpretation we have of what this rule says. It makes no sense. So.
Celia, does this change make sense? Yep, head shaking. Okay. All right, let's go down to the next one.
Rule number 45 is about the number of readings that bills are required to have. So it's not a constitutional requirement, it's a rule requirement that bills have 3 readings, which are by title only. This language goes on to say in current rule, however, upon order of the House, which means the House directs it, or at the request of the reporter of the bill, who's reporting it on the floor, or the introducer of the bill, or its speaker's direction. Second or third reading shall be in full or for a portion, be read in full for a portion of it as requested. So the big picture, this language would strike the ability of the bill reporter or a bill introducer to want to have a bill read in full, which means reading its full text. I'll turn it back over to Bart.
Well, and I would just add, if you're the reporter of the bill, you can read it yourself. And it's unclear, the introducer of the bill, technically that would be the introducer, the main sponsor, or and there could be 50, or, the entire body. And anyone could say, I want the whole thing read. Just, again, makes no sense. Why would we want to do that? If there's a reason to do it, there could be a motion to read the whole thing. We could vote to do it, or a portion of it, or the speaker could say, this is important. I want to hear the whole thing read. It seems like it's adequate. Anyway, that's where.
Yeah, and I think if there's some extraordinary reason that some individual member feels that the full text should be read at the risk of incurring the wrath of their fellow members, they can stand up and read the whole bill out loud.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need this rule.
Any other thoughts on this? Feeling good? All right, let's go to the next one.
Okay, then we move on to Rule 48. This is your committee bill rule, and this change results from some interesting research because there was a question, what is it saying except as provided in Rules 25 and 35, committee bills get placed on the notice calendar and then proceed to action calendar. Rule 35 makes sense. Rule 35 is your money committee required referral. If a bill, including a committee bill, has a fiscal impact, it will have to be by the rule referred to Ways and Means or Appropriations as applicable. But what is Rule 25? What was that reference there? Except as provided in Rule 25, committee bills go on notice. Well, Rule 25 is your committee jurisdiction rule, and doing some research, it was back in what I believe that this, what is now an outdated reference to Rule 25 is that until the 1973-1974 biennium, when the rule was amended, this committee, the Committee on Rules, had the authority to introduce bills requested by heads of state departments or commissions. And when this committee would introduce a bill on behalf of a head of a state department or commission, they were then to be referred to the appropriate standing committee. That provision was eliminated in the 73-74 biennium, but And that is the only answer I could think of why there would still be a reference to Rule 25, which is otherwise your jurisdictions of your standing committees. Because that would have said, if this committee introduced something on behalf of an executive branch entity, then it goes to the committee of reference.
Are members okay with this change? Questions?
Good hunt and find.
All right.
I'm glad I didn't, because I thought, oh shoot, I ran out of time. I didn't look up what Rule 25 was, and I'm glad I didn't.
You wouldn't find it there, yeah.
You would say, why is it?
Right. I would say, what in the world?
Okay, Rule 52 is your rule on how you treat resolutions. There's the 3 options for resolutions: read and adopt in full, read by title and place on the next day's action calendar, or treat as a bill and refer to committee in speaker's discretion. What the issue right now with this rule is not really an issue because your custom has picked up. Where this rule leads off is that Rule 52 right now only refers to joint resolutions. It doesn't address at all what happens with House resolutions, but we treat House resolutions the same way. So this language would add, to the extent applicable, a House resolution shall be so treated. Why does this draft use this language? Again, it's looking at the corresponding Senate Rule 51, which has the same structure, talking about those 3 options for joint resolution, and then its last sentence says, to the extent applicable, a Senate resolution shall be so treated. So again, it's that mirroring Senate language for consistency between the 2 chambers.
All right, are we good with this one? Looking around. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okey-dokey. This next one, 84, is about the people who are admitted in the well of the House. Just confirming, well of the House means where all of your seats are, plus the Senate seats. And so this is a list of the people who are permitted in the well of the House. The first amendment here would be to remove reference to district judges, current district judges, because we no longer have state level district judges from your judicial restructuring bill from.
I was wondering about how they felt about being thrown out.
Yeah,
That's a
they
good
no longer
reminder.
exist. They no longer exist. I think, what year was that? Oh, I should have had it handy here, but I believe it was in early 2010s maybe? No more district judges. They got folded into the Superior Court. Then what this language would go on to do is separate items by semicolons. So this first part of the rule is basically talking about current officers, then semicolon, former, and this would help clean up to help explain what this rule is saying, semicolon, former governors, lieutenant governors, justices of the Supreme Court, superior judges, purposefully leaving in district judges, because we're talking about former district judges, just in case there's a former district judge still out there, and former members of the General Assembly, semicolon. The rest of the language goes on to talk about other people. So district judges and attorneys of the US, that means federal, members of other state legislatures, it really should be lowercase here, the secretary and assistant secretary of the Senate, etc.
All right. Thoughts, questions? Representative Donahue.
Just a clarification, I had not, thought through, what the well of the House I think of usually as that center section. And if it includes the Senate seats, this suggests then that the speaker would have to officially allow it when we let members of the public use the Senate seats. And I assume that this still allows for a standing custom that when the Senate is not visiting one on informal session, that the standing custom is that the speaker does allow that.
There are exceptions though. So for example, I have a no stalking order against someone. That person would not be permitted to be in the chamber.
Sure.
If there's a rule violation in the building, and someone's a repeat trying to, I think there are certain circumstances where I would say no, but our custom and practice is that generally we're saying yes.
Right. It would be a identified exception when you were not going to let that happen.
I just want to confirm our practice now that I have been enforcing as clerk is that if it's a member of the public that wants to sit on a session, members of the public are in the gallery. the first floor or second floor unless approved by the speaker. Legislative staff are authorized to sit in the Senate seats as they always have, but lobbyists, other people, unless should be sitting in the gallery. And that reflects prior practice. I think in somewhat of the recent past, it's been more flexible, but looking back in my office's records, the well of the house has always been interpreted to me to include the Senate seats, and guests should be sitting in the balcony, first or second floor.
Okay, well, that's from my 20 years here, that would be a radical change in custom and practice. So, you know, I'm concerned about understanding the rationale, because that's sounded like your interpretation was the custom was that, you know, unless you said no, that the public was allowed and.
Right. I think because of COVID,
Right.
we had been doing more about members in the back.
Mhm.
And then in certain situations when people request, like, for example, we have someone giving the devotional, they have several different people with them. I don't know, I feel like this is a place where we've been trying to come back in a way that reflects some of the changes we made during COVID and some security concerns, while also allowing flexibility to have some members of the public in the Senate seats.
So, yeah, it sounds like for COVID reasons, it would be a plus because you're spreading out, you know, fewer people squeezed together in the gallery by spreading them out. To me, this is like a big, I understand temporary changes with COVID, but that suggesting that this is like a permanent decision to change a longstanding custom pre-COVID is a whole different thing.
All right, so I'm gonna go Connor, Representative Long, McCoy, and then Bartholomew.
Just on a day-to-day staff level, we've run into two things, or actually really three things, because you all don't have personal office space. Many of you choose to work on the floor. We've had it where people that are not elected members are having like meetings in the Senate seats. And it just creates a problem for that position. I know that's separate than what we're talking about. There's also security issues in which the clerk's office has had people basically, because they can't get through the security door, choose to go around and enter on that backside. And so, which is also off limits. So having a more uniform policy of who can be in those Senate seats has helped. And we also have an equity issue of if we do have large groups, people will choose. And we ran into this with the Sergeant at Arms having to explain why certain people got to sit here and others couldn't. And this included an issue in which someone had mobility issues. We were then forced to ask people to move right before the session started, and they couldn't understand why. So it gives more flexibility to meet specific needs for someone that might have a mobility challenge, to have that seat open for that circumstance, and then also staff that need to be there, or like we saw with the devotional recently, when there's larger instruments in play, they have a little bit more space for that issue. So that's just some of the day-to-day stuff that we've seen.
My hand was up to let you know that you got a hand up behind me.
Thank you.
But since you recognized me,
Yeah.
I'll just say, I actually understand the reasons behind this and actually agree with it.
So, you know, we've had people there. So when, is it you that gives the okay or Sergeant at Arms? Because people who may be recognized for a House resolution, and they sit in those Senate seats and, you know, you recognize them and they stand up.
It's
Is it-
been
do they go through
coordinated.
you?
They
You
start with the
coordinate?
Sergeant at Arms, and then it comes to us, right?
Okay,
Unless
so I
it's
just
changed.
wanted to get that sense clear. And for me, I mean, sitting in that last row with civilization behind me, I actually am the one that championed to get that clear glass behind there, because I know, so you at the podium with, I mean, kind of the Senate seats are behind you too, which is kind of, I don't know. And then people used to sit on the windowsills. It's just a little bit too close, I think, for when we're trying to perform our duties in the House. So I think it gives a more of a sense of the chamber. It's the chamber.
Representative Bartholomew, and then Mulvaney Stanek.
I think this is a valuable discussion for the Rules Committee, but I'll just point out that it goes way beyond what this resolution actually does.
I was about to, but I didn't want to interrupt people who hadn't spoken, but I agree. As to both things you said, I think there's value, but this doesn't change that discussion or affect it at all.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Representative Mulvaney Stanton?
I had a question actually about people with mobility or wheelchair users and where they would be able to access following the chamber in person, because there's 2 steps that go into the well and then there's no elevator to the balcony. So what is our current practice? And I do think it's a place in rules to make sure that that is never determined by the speaker, that it is by practice and just for accessibility purposes clearly stated in our rules. So what happens now? I actually have not witnessed a wheelchair user yet in the space. So
Oh, yeah, definitely. We have, and so there's 2 areas, and I will defer in case something has changed, but currently there is a spot that is somewhat reserved for someone who is in a wheelchair, has mobility issues, but right by where Representative McCoy is, on one of those sides of the front door.
Mhm.
And then there's also behind you on your side, space there. And those 2 spaces have been used many times and we haven't expanded those. There's been 1 or 2 times where we've had to be flexible and create other space, but it's been very rare.
And so is that custom right now, or is that, is there a reason not to have that be more formally stated in rules, that there is a rule within the House to say how we handle accessibility for physical space of the chamber?
I think there's a custom and practice of what the clerk has done working with individuals, because sometimes individuals have different needs or different accommodations that need to be made. And so the Sergeant at Arms has worked really hard with people to make sure that people have accessibility in a place that is safe and present in the room.
I see our clerk has the page
Yeah,
open, but
yes.
just a reminder that last term, we did adopt a rule applying
Right.
the ADA to our chamber. So it has to,
Yeah.
however we do it, it has to be done. So
That's right.
90B.
Rule 9, yep. Thank you for that.
And just on that point, the Sergeant at Arms, and if you all remember, we have a consultant, Tricia Harper, formerly of BGS, that's helped us navigate our building and changing things. She and the Sergeant at Arms, working with the members, are looking at future options. It's just tricky with our chamber. But they are looking at different possibilities to increase accessibility and increase the options available to folks. So that's ongoing.
Great.
We can check.
Including to members, I assume.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just
Yeah,
the
great.
totality of the chamber.
Good to hear that.
All right, I'm looking at the clock and it's 10:07. Are folks okay to try to wrap this up? We're so close. We have 1 more left. Okay,
As long as I can blame the speaker to my chair.
that's fine.
Rule 86 is about electronics on the floor or during session. And the language, I'm just going to skip to the end of it. It says right now the use of telephones or allowing telephones to ring in the House chamber during a session thereof is prohibited. And this is updating language to reflect current technology, saying making audio or video calls or allowing electronic devices to ring or send audible notifications in the chamber during a session is prohibited.
Members okay with this? Same heads nod. All right,
All right, the last, I'm sorry, Madam.
go ahead.
So we just went through the first resolve clause, which would actually amend the House rules. The second resolve clause is similar to statutory revision authority, which is given to Ledge Council in order to update the statutes for consistency and legislative drafting style. And this reflects similarly that language for the House rules. This language right now says the clerk is directed to make technical capitalization, punctuation, and other purely non-substantive stylistic amendments to the rules and orders of the House in accordance with legislative drafting style. Let me give you an example. Sometimes you use serial commas, sometimes you do not. Your capitalization is not consistent throughout. It is those types of non-substantive, purely technical changes that this second resolve clause would give to the clerk to conform to legislative drafting style. And if members are interested, if you wanted to see it, one thing I was going to mention, if you move forward with this language, one of the things I could do is highlight for you all of those changes that could be made if you're interested in reviewing it.
No, okay. All right.
We have to unhighlight.
Any further thoughts or questions on this last result? Are we good with these updates? All right. Anyone would entertain a motion? Okay, great. Representative Long moves that we adopt HR 6. Did we make any changes or no? Can we scroll up? Was there any changes? I don't think we did. I think we did, right? Okay, just double checking. All right. Great. Any further discussion? If not, I will call the roll. Representative Bartholomew,
Yes.
Representative Donahue,
Yes.
Representative James,
Yes.
Representative Long,
Yes.
Representative McCoy,
Yes.
Representative Tooth,
Yes.
and I am a yes. So the motion carries 7-0. And who would like to report this one?
Well, it is
It's
John.
your.
It is John. All right, Bartholomew, we got you.
You're up.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you, everyone. Meeting is adjourned.